Hello, and welcome to the From A to Z Azure Virtual Conference, brought to you by Obstility and the Skill Me Up Academy. This session is about migrating to Azure 101, and I am your presenter, Kit Skinner. Please be aware this is a pre-recorded session. To give you a little bit of information about myself, my name is Kit Skinner. I am a cloud training architect here at Obstility. Help developing courses here at Obstility. In addition, I have several years of experience in IT, especially around infrastructure and security, and have several years of experience of helping people migrate to Azure from on-premise environments as well as other clouds. So today's session, we're going to be covering over a lot of the planning of your migration into Azure, some of the tools available in the migration, and then also we'll be talking about the Cloud Adoption Framework pieces, also known as CAF, and then how you can build your cloud strategy and what your next steps are in moving into the cloud. Now, when we're talking about migrating to the cloud, there is a lot of talk around the idea of just moving something into the cloud and getting it up and running. But order to have a successful migration and to have your project be successful, you really want to make sure you take the time to assess your environment and plan your migration and then actually move your resources into Azure. So we want to make sure we take some time to focus on what's involved in doing that planning and getting those resources into Azure. When we talk about doing a plan of migration, we usually break it down into four key areas. We have the assessment phase, where we're actually looking at the environment, helping identify what is there, what needs to be migrated, and what's going to take to get them migrated into Azure. Then we'll also be talking about the actual migration phase, which is where we actually take the data that we've found in the assessment phase and actually moving it into Azure and getting it up and going there. Then we focus on the optimizing of those resources once they're in Azure, different ways that we can help optimize those usage, and then the ongoing task, which is perpetual of monitoring and making sure that we're maintaining the environment appropriately. So when we start the assessment phase, what we're looking to do is identifying the applications that we're looking to migrate in Azure. Because regardless of what your environment has, is that usually your solution is made up of multiple different applications. So if we can break it down and identify what we can do with those applications, we can help identify the best solution to get into Azure. The first and most common option most people think of when they think of migrating to Azure is what is often referred to as rehosting. What rehosting is that we take your existing infrastructure, whether it be on physical machine, virtual machine, whatever operating systems you have on premise, and we just basically migrate those into Azure and run them as virtual machines within Azure. This is a very tried and true methodology. It works pretty well for most solutions. However, you may find that it doesn't necessarily work for all your solutions and may not be the most optimal solution for getting you the best bang for your buck in your Azure environment. However, it is something that is very common and is very well done. We have several tools to help you with this, but this is definitely one thing that you can look at doing is just the basic rehosting, where we take those environments and move them to virtual machines. The next option that we run into frequently is what's called refactoring. And what we're talking about with a refactoring is that we take whatever was on that virtual machine, whether it be some sort of application, a database, whatever it is, and move it into a PaaS solution that's in Azure. What this means is that we take something like a SQL database and we move it into Azure SQL. That way, you're not having to maintain that virtual machine or continue to patch that SQL Server. Instead, you can offload those responsibilities to Azure, and you can use the dynamic growth and functionality that's built into the Azure SQL PaaS environment without having to move an entire virtual machine up there in order to maintain that database. In addition, another common scenario is if you have a web app, something that's running either on an IIS or a LAMP type solution, and you want to move it into something like a PHP Linux-based web app or a Windows-based .NET framework, or vice versa, whatever it needs to be. Maybe just a basic web app, and we actually can move those frequently into a web app solution. Obviously, it depends on your application and how you're running it and what's actually involved with it. Another potential scenario is if you want to migrate your file storage from a file server or a file cluster of some kind and move it into an Azure file share or storage account. Again, in any of these solutions, what we're looking to do is remove that underlying operating system that's continuing to have to be maintained and is its own limiting factor, and potentially migrate directly into a platform as a service solution to where we can utilize the dynamic growth as well as the support matrices to be able to better utilize the resources that are available to us in Azure. Then we can start to get into a potential option of doing some re-architecting. In re-architecting, what we may be looking to do is that we have an application that we have a lot of the structure around it and maybe a lot of the code pieces, and it's not necessarily most efficient to move it into virtual machine. Maybe it's got some custom code that maybe wouldn't be able to be run in a web app, or maybe it's just if we do a few small tweaks, we could go ahead and get it to work in Azure utilizing PaaS resources without having to go back and redesign the entire architecture. Maybe you have to do some small changes to get to work with SQL paths. Maybe we need to do some quick recompiling to get it to run into a container. There's some things like that that we could look at maybe doing a re-architecting. These are those types of tasks where it requires some work on the development side, but is something that could potentially save you lots of money down the road. Sometimes these are things that people want to do as a future ask after you move to virtual machines. Maybe the application, for whatever reason, doesn't run as a virtual machine. Maybe it's something that's tied too tightly to your on-premise infrastructure, and it isn't practical to mirror that in Azure. Duplicating IPs. Maybe it's something tied to the hardware, whatever it is, and maybe we're just looking to do a small change. In those scenarios, we're looking at basically just doing a re-architecting of your application. Also, these re-architecting can be something that maybe you go ahead and take advantage of a more efficient solution, like a serverless type of solution or a microservices type of structure. In these types of scenarios, we can maybe bypass moving your resources into Azure. And all these are going to be as evaluated as part of the assessment phase. That is going out and looking at your environment and doing an inventory of your applications, helping you identify how they're utilized, what their dependencies are, and help you identify ones that may be able to use one of these solutions to get up into Azure. One of the final places that we run into is a rebuild. What we look at in a rebuild phase is this is an application that is not something that we can just quickly transition to Azure. It's not something we can just move across into a virtual machine. Maybe it's some really old code that isn't supported by Azure, or maybe we don't have the source code anymore, and it just is not something that we could quickly make some changes to. For whatever reason, we just have to go back through and we have to rebuild the application in order to work in Azure. This obviously requires a lot of work and is um, something that requires something then more than just doing a quick re-architecting of it. And maybe it's just easier just to start from scratch rather than trying to find some way just to manipulate to get to work. Um, it's not something to be totally afraid of because there are scenarios where maybe your on-premise environment is just too unstable, your hardware is so old, maybe you're paying a lot for the rent. Regardless what it is, this may be the opportune time to go and take a look at that application, maybe take the opportunity to put some man hours behind it and actually do a rebuilding. Maybe work with a cloud partner to help you develop the application to work directly natively in the cloud to be able to immediately take advantage of those solutions and just be able to import your data from your previous application and run it natively in Azure and just do a full jump at that point in time. Those are some options that are still available, even if our application itself, as is, won't run in Azure. Um, there are usually some ways that you can get something to work in it, but maybe this is the most opportune solution for you. It's basically doing a rebuilding. Again, usually rebuilding is something that does require a lot of work, so it's not something we do as one of the first ideal solutions, but it is definitely something that is on the table and available to you. Then finally, there's the final solution of doing a replace. In a replace scenario, what you're looking to do is actually move to some sort of third-party solution, just doing a completely different application to solve your solution. And these types of scenarios, this is again usually something that's usually more legacy, something that isn't something that we're looking to rebuild. We just have the information, but we want to go ahead and start using something new. Maybe you don't want to maintain that code anymore, or the other options, I can start looking at SaaS solutions as well. If there was something that you basically were doing data entry for and keeping a lot of information on premise for this legacy application, maybe now's a great time to go ahead and look at doing a SaaS implementation. Maybe it was doing HIPAA forms. There's lots of medical services out there that do SaaS services now. Um, Salesforce as an option for keeping track of your sales information. There's lots of different solutions out there from third parties that are now natively cloud, and they go ahead and do a turnkey solution. You just bring your access and your app data into it, and they'll support the application and keep it up to date and keep it maintained. If you're having to look at replacing your application, go ahead and start considering those as potential solutions for you. Obviously, it doesn't necessarily mean that every one of those, but this is again something that maybe you have to look at doing as just part of your assessment phase. Is that if an application just will not move into the cloud, it's not going to work well in the cloud. Maybe now we go ahead and take that opportunity to look at a new solution, something that is going to be able to move us into the future, something that isn't tying down the environment and isn't leaving us with a large weight around our necks of just an old application that we've never had the opportunity to actually do modernization or do an update for it. Maybe now's the time to go ahead and start looking at as we move to the cloud. And again, this isn't necessarily for your entire solution. Maybe it's just an individual application that you're looking at. Because now that we're moving into the cloud and we're moving into a dynamic workspace, we can look at the individual applications potentially and how they go forward as a whole solution, and not necessarily just looking at trying to keep everything exactly as it was as a status quo. Once we've done the assessment, then there's the actual process of doing the migration. Now, two of the most common migration pieces that we look at is doing a virtual machine migration or database migrations. And when we're looking at these types of scenarios, there's some common steps that you'll run into. And they're very common regardless of which method you're using. But the idea here is that you're basically going to get your on premise environment up and ready. Then you're going to start doing the replication of the initial information. And then you'll be doing a actual test of the environment or a replication of your data, and then the actual migration itself, the actual committing of the data across. So when we're working with virtual machines, uh, there's a process where we get agents on them, where we're replicating blocks across. We're getting them up in Azure. Once they're in Azure, we can test them. We can do final migration with the databases. We're going to assess those databases, migrate the schema so that you have your table structures, your access information, all the layout of your actual databases, and then the actual running of the migration and actually getting the data into Azure. And the reason why we break that up a little bit is that if we're moving the schema up there, we can at least do some basic testing, even if it's just empty data or limited data. Um, Whereas if you're replicating your entire database, again, there's usually lots of changes, lots of churn. There's potential issues around those, uh, replicating that environment if depending on which method you use. Some of the solutions will have a copy up there that you can immediately test against, but we can't necessarily rely on that for all the scenarios because there are going to be some scenarios where maybe we don't have the full bandwidth where we can do constant changes to your database, and so we just want to get the schema up there as a test environment. So there's a few different options around those, and then obviously monitoring the migration. Again, if we're doing something like a quote unquote large shipping of your data across, we can have that come across pretty regularly. But if we're going to have to do a entire data replication at once because we don't have the bandwidth, in that case, we may have to be doing some longer monitoring of the data replication. So a few different solutions around that. We'll get into that. So when we're looking at doing VM migration, there's a couple different basic solutions. One of the most common ones was doing a VM-based migration. And a VM-based migration, what we're looking at actually doing is we'll have an agent that runs on the virtual machines, and then that agent that's running on each one of those virtual machines block rate, uh, as a block write is detected, we'll move those over to the process server, and the process server will then move that block change up into Azure. Azure will then come back as a follow process and take those block changes and move them into a disk image. And it will continue to do this on an ongoing basis. What this allows us to do is have points in time of your virtual machines, of your running on-premise environment, um, common to within a couple of minutes. Frequently it's 5, maybe 10 minutes old of your data to where you could run a virtual machine, have that up and going immediately. And that's again just an ongoing, continually replication process. When it comes time to do your final migration, you can get a more frequent or more recent copy, but this is just one of those an ongoing process, so that in the event you have a disaster, you can go ahead and cut over immediately because this was based on disaster recovery type of solution. But for migration purposes, it works really well because every time we're doing a write out to your operating system, we'll be able to capture that in Azure. Okay. Now, this particular solution again requires us to run an agent on every one of those virtual machines. This is also useful if you're going to be running against a physical server. So, if you have an old piece of hardware or running directly on the bare metal and you want to replicate that into Azure into a virtual machine, you can use this technology as well to get that same system up there. This will work also with a lot of different cloud environments and different scenarios. But this basically allows you to talk directly to the operating system to get that information into Azure as a running OS and running VM within Azure. This also is a solution where if we're running potentially thousands of virtual machines, it may not be the most efficient because we do have to get those agents on each one of those virtual machines. And while it's not prohibitive and it's not something that we couldn't do, there are some additional scenarios that we have to make it a little bit more efficient. And those are where we get into what's called the agentless migrations. Um, Hyper-V Hyper-V, being a Microsoft-based hypervisor, natively supports the agentless migration, so we can talk directly to the Hyper-V host and be able to pull the virtual machines as they're writing to the disk that the Hyper-V host maintains, and being able to get those up in Azure without having to go out and install agents to each one of those virtual machines. We also have this capability to be able to do it with VMware and be able to select the vCenter and the vhosts to run the virtual machines to replicate the virtual machines up into Azure. What this allows us to do is that we can just set up the configuration to be able to talk to those key servers, those key hosts, and not have to worry about trying to reach out and touch each one of those virtual machines. It gives us the ability to be more efficient with our resources and being able to make sure that we can replicate things in the most efficient way. Once you've gotten the resources up and running in Azure, then we get into the optimization phase. In the optimization phase, what you're looking to do is actually identify what your costs are. And you can break these down into individual resources, resource groups, let you be able to see the trending, help you identify how your costs are actually being distributed across your environment, and helping you identify any trends that maybe are growing exponentially and maybe something that would be more harmful to your pocketbook on the long run, or maybe just something where you have additional growth that wasn't expected. In addition, there are also advisories that can help you identify virtual machines or resources that maybe aren't scaled appropriately. Maybe you have a PaaS database that is very high, but you never utilize those resources, or maybe you have a web app that is maybe not being hit very often in the app pool. So there may be some options that you have there to maybe scale back your resources and save you some additional funding costs. There may also be some options to move to a different tier to get you a little bit different solution, maybe get you some better choices without having to have an increase substantial increase in cost. There's some several different recommendations that are made in the cost analysis tools and the costing tools within the Azure space to help you optimize and better utilize uh, the resources that you're spending in Azure to the best of your ability. And then finally get into the monitor phase. In the monitor phase, what we're looking to do is actually capture what's happening with your environment. We're gathering up the insights of your applications, your virtual machines, helping identify what those performance metrics are like, helping you identify what's going on in your environment, um, pulling in things like event logs, performance details, access logs, and helping you identify what's going on in your resources and monitor them in Azure, not only for availability, but perhaps changes in the environment. You can set up alerts in the monitor space, help you identify if there's a particular problem in a virtual machine, but also help you identify if maybe there's a scaling opportunity, maybe something where you can do an automatic scaling of your web app based on connection resources. Um, or if you know that there's a particular time framing that's coming up, there's lots of different solutions based around it. And the monitors resources gives you a consistent platform to work with all the Azure resources to gather the information in a single pane, single interface, be able to utilize the same alerts and the same tools to help grow and monitor your resources effectively. So now we talked about the planning phases. Let's talk about how we can utilize that for the cloud adoption framework. When we talk about people moving into the cloud space, there's usually four key stages that you can identify as the evolution and the adoption of their journey. For instance, they usually start with an experimentation phase where you're testing out the environment, seeing if how it would work and just the general understanding of it. Usually, then moving into a proof of value, doing the first few workloads. This may be where we start doing some of the migrations, getting a few key applications up there, and just starting off and getting those landing zones in place. And then you start to move into more of a scale up. Once you've been able to prove that the efficiency is there and that you're able to utilize it to the best of its ability, you can start increasing the value of it. You can start building off more resources, moving more things into the cloud, maybe re architecting your application to work directly with PaaS resources, moving away from virtual machines and doing something that's more of a container based dynamic solution. Maybe being able to utilize several different PaaS systems to be able to orchestrate your information without having to be tied to physical regions and being able to distribute your load throughout the globe depending on what you're needing. And then, of course, getting into that maturity phase where you once eventually become fully cloud native and that you are no longer tied to an on premise environment, um, allowing you to take advantage of the dynamic and growing phases or take advantage of the dynamic and growing environments. Taking advantage of the dynamic and resilient environments that's available in Azure and allow you to grow your business on demand. What this leads to is the cloud adoption framework is proven guidance and design that will allow you to implement your business technologies for your organizations to be able to succeed in the cloud. It provides best practice documentations and other resources to help make sure that you're successful in your cloud migration process. Provides tools for IT professionals as well as business managers and decision makers along the process. By utilizing the CAF's best practices, organizations are able to utilize the resources available and make sure that the process that they're doing and the plans that they develop coincide with the business outcomes and the justifications and the intentions of the overall business strategy. The phases follow a similar type of process, just like you have a migration, is that you have your initial strategy. You want to identify what you're doing in your environment, how you're actually going to be moving forward, what your goals are, what you're trying to accomplish here. Some organizations, they want to be able to take advantage of the dynamic growth of the cloud. Some organizations want to be able to move away from a physical presence. They want to they want to remove that cost from the balance sheets. Other organizations want to take advantage of the new technologies, be able to use the different resources that are available and remove some of the management overhead that they have to deal with on premise and be able to utilize the newer technologies. Regardless of what the reason is, it's best to define what that strategy is and what you're trying to achieve, so that you can ensure your plans and solutions meet those goals. And obviously, you start doing those plans, start identifying what you're going to be doing, helping you develop your readiness plan as well as your overall cloud adoption plan. Then you can start getting into your readiness guides, helping you set up your first landing zone, getting your best environment, making sure that you have your best practice validation set up and ready to go, and ensuring that you're achieving what you're looking to achieve and that you're not bringing in some overhead or some legacy processes that are going to cause problems. Then you actually get into the actual adoption. Again, we talked about migration here as part of the main topic today, but there's also options around innovate and bringing in additional solutions into Azure. Can happen side by side, or it can be two different approaches, two different plans, depending on what you're needing and what your organization is based around. And then the underlying overall goals of the governing and the management. These are ongoing processes. Obviously, the adoption is bringing something into it. But once you bring into it, we usually want to have some standards based on regardless of what type of solution we're bringing into it. We have consistent governance and consistent policies that we make sure that we're maintaining, and then also giving the ongoing operations team the ability to manage and control and monitor it so that they can make sure that their platform is successful and that they're able to achieve the goals of the ongoing systems perpetually. A couple of the key tools that are available are what's called a Cloud Journey Tracker, and then also the Azure Architect Overview. The Cloud Journey Tracker will help you identify what phases you're at on different projects and help you keep track of where you are in your process as you journey through the cloud and helping you identify next steps and additional resources available to you. And then also the Azure Architect Review allows you to assess and examine your existing workloads and help you build up additional best practices in your environment. It's also important that you take time to help identify a good baseline for your governance as part of your CAF process. This helps you identify good common standards that you need across your environment to make sure that you have a consistent control and management maintaining of your environment. That way, you can make sure that you have best security practices regardless of what type of application you're moving into the environment. You make sure that you maintain a consistent standard across your organization and make sure that you have your best practices involved. And then at the end, we end up with our governance model, which the end state that fosters the trust and confidence around it, where we have our corporate policies, our governance disciplines, identifying the baselines, and all these are available as part of the CAF process to help identify how the environment's going to be controlled and maintained. Migration is just the process of getting the information up into Azure, but once you're up there, you're going to be running it for a much longer period. You may find your migration phase may only end up being a few weeks, maybe a couple of months, but ideally, your environment's going to be up there for potentially years. So you need to make sure that you have a good governance strategy behind how you maintain and control that environment and how you allow it to grow and build and become a better process for you going forward. This is a key portion of the CAF environment, helping you identify how you're going to govern that going forward. And this leads us into building our actual cloud strategy. When we actually talk about building our cloud strategy, this is where we want to talk about how we're going to utilize this. Beyond just doing the migration and doing utilizing the CAF model, we also want to talk about how we can build our strategy. And a lot of that is around the cloud adoption framework workflow that is provided to us to help identify what those pieces are. Because the strategy, the plan, the readiness, and the adoption, while this is something we may start off with, what you may actually find is that you really need to start at the governing phase to help identify what it is. And then, regardless of what type of adoption you do, what type of implementation you do of your environment, as you manage it and maintain it, you will find that things change in your environment. There may be regulatory change, there may be application change, there may be unforeseen advantages or unforeseen situations that you run into, in which case you need to make changes to those governance changes. That can then feed into the strategy, how you help identify it, how you make those changes. So this is an ongoing circular process that you want to make sure is maintained an ongoing piece. This is not just something you stack up there and you leave and is nothing that is ever changed or updated or optimized. You want to make sure that you have an ongoing process, you have a review, you have an update, you have the ability to do that. And as part of this is the landing zones, getting the environment set up, making sure that you have an enterprise scale set as part of your growth, making sure that you have a consistent environment because you can have multiple different subscriptions with your scenarios. You can have multiple different areas, multiple different places as you bring in new applications, new solutions. You want to make sure that you have a good customized uh, landing zone that is useful for your environment. There's a lot of best practices and templates out there for your landing zones, but you want to make sure that you have a consistent experience regardless of how you're coming up in the environment. In addition, you want to try and make sure you're reutilizing artifacts whenever possible. You want to make sure that you have templates that equate to what type of virtual machines you're doing. The networking, the other pieces that are involved in the environment. You want to make sure that you have things that are consistently defined as a standard as you continue through your process. These aren't necessarily something directly in the migration phase, but these are things you need to think about as you continue to migrate into the Azure space and continue to go through the clouds. Uh, bringing your virtual machines across into Azure, they are going to have their pre-configured notions. They're going to have the existing applications running on those virtual machines, but you probably want to have a standard going forward of a virtual machine that you spin up new into Azure. And those are the types of things that you can build up as artifacts and templates that you can then build off of. These are also referred to as Azure Resource Manager templates or ARM templates. There's also a new language coming out called Bicep, which builds on top of ARM. So that's the name of it. And those are all different resources, different ways you can maintain those artifacts going forward. Some of the things when you think about when you're doing your cloud governance is there's the naming standards, the tagging conventions, security compliance, uh, you know, cost and reporting optimization. Again, when you move into the cloud, moving your data is only one piece of it. Once you move into the cloud, there's lots of different resources to be able to identify. And there's also some, standards you need to be working with because you're going to be moving to a large cloud environment. Um, your virtual machines obviously probably had some naming standard on premise. Maybe you didn't have a very consistent one. Now's the opportunity to take the time to come up with explicit naming standards. You can then build these into policy standards in Azure, and Azure will automatically enforce them. If somebody tries to create a virtual machine that doesn't adhere to your naming standard, it will come back and flag them. They need to update this. You can also make sure that you have tagging in your environment so that you make sure that the responsible party for each one of your resources are tagged so that you can track and see who is supposed to be working with it. You can also charge back to cost centers with the tagging or keep track of what resources are used for which solution. Those can all be maintained in a tagging solution. And you can, again, require those through your policies and make sure those are set up. You can also make sure that you're getting your security and compliance through your policies, making sure that you are adhering to any regulatory requirements can all be maintained in it. And then again, working at your cost optimization resources, make sure that you're effectively using it. All these need to be part of your governance strategy as you're looking to move into the cloud. All right, so with all these pieces and all the talk about the migration, talk about the cloud option framework, what do we see as our next step? So the first thing is that you need to be looking at what your motivations are, what your migrations are as you mature, and then this also becomes a process of cyclical responses. Because as you continue to mature, your motivation change, your migration responsibility change. So you need to look at how you're getting into it. And again, starting with a governance model and looking at those details, looking at the CAF scenarios, helping you identify what's going on in your environment. You also need to be understanding where your motivations are, what you're looking to do. Are you writing this? And again, we have a readiness review in the CAF to help you identify what it is. Are we doing this because we just have hardware depreciation, or are we just looking for licensing changes? Their capacity issue. Do we not have enough hardware? Are we constantly running into, um, limitations? You need to keep in mind that as you continue to move into Azure, you need to understand what your motivations are behind it. So be thinking about that as you start this journey. What's the motivations? Again, this is the beginning phases of the CAF process. So be thinking about that. When you look to do your migration, or try and identify a small group to move up. Don't try and start with something really big because invariably it's going to take a while. It's going to take a lot of resources to get involved. See if maybe there's a small application you can get in there, some low hanging fruit. You consider doing the rehost, which is the lift and shift. We move the virtual machine up there. Try and get that up there. Get your landing zones up and going. Again, we have examples in the CAF as resources to help you get started as landing zones, but also try and think about it. We talk about landing zones. This is where we talk about setting up your initial virtual network. You connect your to your on-premise environment. Try and get that initial place where you can get things up there and start working with them, but still allow them to communicate to your on-premise environment. So that's what we talk about when we say our landing zone. We also make sure that we have our security set up on in this environment. We get the monitoring set up so we can start monitoring those resources as we move them up there. And also working with the Lighthouse migrations and being able to move those across. And then again, looking at the maturity of it, making sure that as we continue to have it up there, not just doing one migration and forget about it, we need to be maintaining it and monitoring it as we continue to look for more opportunities to make sure that it grows better, be able to utilize our resources, being able to help optimize what's up there. Looking at the reviews as security vulnerabilities come into play, the security monitoring can help you identify when those vulnerabilities may be hurting your environment, or maybe uh, or your environment may be susceptible to those vulnerabilities. There also may be new features that become available, and the assessments can help you identify that there's also, as new features become available, the recommendations can help identify that there's some changes that you need in the environment. Maybe a new virtual machine classification comes out that may better utilize that your resources may be able to better utilize for your virtual machine. There's lots of different things that you can continue to look at around your maturing platform as you continue through the process. So this brings us to the end of our presentation. And again, we talked about how we can plan your migration into Azure, some of the tools we can utilize as that migration, and also how we can introduce in the cloud adoption framework and we start utilizing those resources to make our solutions better and come up with a good strategy, be able to utilize some of those tools that are out there. And then also being able to build our cloud strategy, how we can help identify what's available to us, and so we talked about the next steps. Some of the things that we can do as our first stages and getting into the cloud adoption framework and getting started with taking our low hanging fruit and looking at it, and then to progress and move through our environments. Again, my name is Kit Skinner. I appreciate you all coming out to this session on migrating to Azure 101. I really hope this was helpful for you. If you all have any questions or anything, feel free to reach out to me. And thank you very much for your time.